Well, my name is Eleanor Anstruther, and I'm a novelist. And my debut, here it is, came out last year. It's published by Salt. And it's a fictionalised account of a true story. Enid Campbell sold her son to her sister for £500. She was the granddaughter of the 8th Duke of Argyll. She was my grandmother. And the son she sold was my father. Well, I've got lots of advice for anybody writing autofiction or any story about a family history, because I think I could have done it better. I worked on it for 10 years. I was so used to the story that I'd really processed a lot of the trauma around it, really, although I can still feel it now when I talk about it. But for my family, even though it was a well-known story within the family as well, obviously, they hadn't had all that time to get used to the idea of it being a public story. And so I just finished it, sold it. They all knew I was writing it. And then they said, well, can we read it? And I said, sure. And they did. And they were quite shocked. I think not in the telling of it, because I understood it was sympathetic telling, but just the very idea that something personal, if not private, would be out in the world. So I went through about a year of having to learn that people take time to get used to something. And also because it's all of our stories, me and my family, not just mine, but I'm the one who got to tell it. And so my version, and it is just a version, is the one that's now written in stone and is the one that generally people believe is the story. So I think that was something that I had to come to terms with, that's quite a liberty that I've taken with a family story. And, just extend my understanding a little bit, that it takes time for the others to get on board. Happily, luckily they have, they're very proud of it, and they've been supportive. So I'm very pleased. Someone's going to read it and it needs to have pace and it needs to be a cohesive story. And so it means that if you're writing a true story, a fictionalised account of a true story, you have to play kind of fast and loose a little bit with facts and timing, although it's pretty accurate, what I've done. But also, yes, I thought it would be really interesting. And in fact, I was forced into the position to, as you say, walk around the entire story and each character. As a child, I'd always been led to believe, I'd only heard my father's view. He's the only member of the cast, as it were, in this book that I knew. And of course, to him, his mother was a figure that he was very angry at, to say the least. And his Aunt Joan was somebody he loved very much. And it was a very black and white version. And so I began the writing with quite a black and white view. I think I wanted to vilify his mother for a while to get on board. Then I wanted to vindicate her, to be completely the opposite view. None of those worked. And eventually I realised, after about 7 years of trying and failing, that the problem was I was writing it as a daughter. And I had to stop doing that and put on the hat of a writer, or say the cold heart of a writer, really, step away from my family and write it as that, where narrative was king rather than persuasion, which was a big deal, but it was what turned it into a piece of work that could be read and talked about in a book. And I learned a huge amount. And in the end, I came out of it feeling compassion for all of them, because they each have a version of what happened, why they did what they did. They were humans. They were deeply flawed and fallible. They suffered great emotional poverty despite their enormous material wealth. And they each tried their best, even though failed. So it was cathartic for me. I hope it was for the family too. I especially hope it was for them, even though they're long dead. There's something about laying ghosts to rest, and I feel that I've done it. I am a little superstitious about talking about it, but I can say in the sort of mould of this, that it is a fictional retelling of a real event. I ran a commune here a very long time ago, and it's always been ripe for fiction. So it's something around that. I've loved being at home. We live in a very beautiful place, a remote farmhouse on a hill. and incredibly grateful for. In many ways, it's been a pleasure for me. I'm fully aware what hell it's been out there for a huge amount of people. So I feel enormously grateful that we've had a pretty good time. And there's lots of things that I will keep a hold of that I've regained from lockdown. And one of them is to do less, go slower, and just calm down a little bit. And I've really enjoyed that. Well, when my kids were very small, we had great friends who had a house just in New Polzeath. I think it's on that promontory of rock with the little beach beneath it. And then there's the big Polzeath beach to the left. It's a fantastic house, fantastically dangerous. I can't believe I'd be there with my 3-year-old, 2-year-old twins. There's literally a cliff at the end of the garden and no wall. But we would go there every April, or whatever, Easter anyway, and that long drive down and muck about there for a couple of weeks and swim in the icy sea, and absolutely loved it. Would go and pick, what are those things called, the mollusks, and make moule marinière and just lark about, absolutely loved it. So I'm going to read an excerpt from my debut. I'm reading from chapter 14. Joan and Enid are the sisters at the centre of this book, and they both have a secret. Joan's secret is that she's gay, and Enid's secret is that she's dangerously and clinically depressed. Enid has been trying to produce an heir to her mother's fortune. She's failed twice. Her eldest son, I won't tell you how, but has been written off. And then she had a girl, obviously useless. She's now produced another little boy. And Joan, in this scene, is off to see the new heir with her mother. Chapter 14, Joan, 1922. Joan squashed beside her mother in the rich leather interior of the rolls. "I've torn a thread," she said, inspecting the hem of her skirt. "No time to change," Sybil tapped the glass partition with the pewter end of her brolly. "I wasn't going to. I'll snap it." Joan wound the thread around the tip of her finger and pulled sharply. "I'm terribly hot. May I open a window?" The rolls pulled out of Bryanston Square onto George Street and immediately swerved to avoid a bus that had come to an abrupt stop to their right. "Good Lord," said Sybil, gripping the leather handle beside her. "London is becoming absolutely hellish." "You always say that," said Joan, letting in an inch of fresh air. "I shall go up to Scotland for good, you know." "You're always saying that too. We could send Enid with you. At least she'd have proper staff." "I thought you sent her a girl." "I did. Will she keep her, is the question." "Of course she'll keep her." Her mother hadn't stopped smiling or worrying since Douglas came to Bryanston Square last autumn to tell them the terrific news. That was the word he'd used, terrific, grinning with a look of pure fear in his eyes. How apt, Pat had said later when she had told her. "Douglas tells me she sometimes doesn't get up at all," said Sybil. They wound through narrow streets, heading for the fast road west. "The new girl or Enid?" replied Joan. Cars always made her feel slightly sick. Or was it being encased with her mother, gunning towards Berkshire, unable to get out? She couldn't tell. "Enid, of course. One can't go slopping about. It isn't good for the servants. One must set an example." "She has been pregnant." "I was recommended a good stroll every morning. The day after I had you, I was up Dunnicache." "I'm sure you weren't, Mother." The Tower Hill that reared above Loch Finn was too high for any of them, but Ivor used to love it. He'd go up and come back with stories. He'd spun them so well, her mother liked to think she'd been there too. "Very nearly. I certainly got up every day. I wouldn't hear of staying in bed." "Aren't you the Legion?" The way her mother told it, she and Ivor and Enid had simply popped out while she did her embroidery, hardly a blip in her daily life. But Joan had heard the screams when she worked at Charing Cross. The female ward was down the hall and not their domain, but all the Red Cross girls knew it wasn't a matter of, "There we are," a slight spasm and a fresh new baby. Do you think she'll mope? Said Sybil, dabbing her nose with a lilac hanky. Of course she'll mope. If she's going to mope, I shall have to speak to her. She'll enjoy that, said Joan. The afternoon stretched before her, Douglas in a panic, Enid in a depressed fizz. She'd rather put her head in the oven than spend the afternoon with either of them. She hadn't seen him since the spring, not long after their unfortunate meeting in the bar of the Adelphi. He'd found her at home one afternoon and wondered if he might have a quiet word. You see, a man might have his jollies, he'd said, trying desperately hard to be casual. She hadn't felt like rescuing him from his awkwardness. She had lit a cigarette and watched him squirm. What with Enid laid up and everything, now you won't make a fuss of it, will you? Not that there's anything to make a fuss of, you understand. It's really just a bit of nonsense. I'm sure she'd be thrilled to hear that. Now look here, you're not going to tell her, are you? I was referring to Miss Wormald. How do you know her name? Everyone knows her name, Douglas. Everyone. Oh, do be a man, said Joan. It's hardly front page news. Man takes mistress. I hate to tell you this, but you're not the first. Now look here. He tried very hard to be a man then. We all have our little secrets, don't we? She'd asked him to leave after that. She hadn't seen Enid since last summer. How would she be now? No doubt the same, a depressed fizz, her pain strewn about like driftwood, a new baby to trumpet. Babies were nothing but a bore. Who cared until they were grown enough to stop puking and start holding a decent conversation? Fergus had been able to hold a decent conversation by the time he was 3. Better than his parents anyway, and a lot more fun. In his last letter, Douglas had said he was really quite up and about, as if that made up for everything. She imagined he'd be propped somewhere, not the boy who'd picked daisies on the lawn, who chatted funny nonsense and pushed his head under her arm and called her Dodo, but the new, half-darkened boy who they would all have to get used to. Maybe he would call her Dodo again. And I will see you at North Cornwall Book Festival. Can't wait.